Hey guys, real quick, if we reach 10,000 likes, I will also cover the strongest gods in these planes and show you what cool abilities they can do. Please, 10,000, please, please. Alright, thank you. As he slithers forward, you expect a squeal of metal scraping, for the body of this snake man seems forged of fire-filled bronze. Indeed, the skin between scales, eyes, lips, all the soft parts glow with what must be heat because the pointed rod of metal in its hands looks like a blacksmith's tool left too long in the forge. This is the Salamander, a creature born of fire. They slither across the sea of ash, their sinuous coils and jagged spines smoldering. Intense heat washes off their bodies while their yellow eyes glow like candles in the deep-set hollows of their hawkish faces. We are, of course, as always, going to check the monster manual to see what they tell us about them, and then we will unleash hidden lore about them that you probably don't know. But first, a word from our sponsor. This video is brought to you by Stibbles, Codex of Companions. We finally got it, guys. It's here. So look, as a DM, I love my crazy monsters, I love my dungeons and my traps, but you know what my players actually want? They want to pet the damn dog at the entrance of the dungeon. They want to take that dog home and then love it. The problem is that there isn't any rule set specifically designed for pets in Dungeons & Dragons. It is a part of D&D that is completely neglected. Familiars are easy to deal with because you summon them through magic and they are magically engineered to obey you, but that's not how pets or companions are or should be. If you're not a beast master ranger, how are you supposed to tame a boar or an elephant? In D&D, pseudo dragons are supposed to be the go-to wizard companion, yet nobody tames them because there are no rules for it other than maybe being a warlock and then simply dominate them. Here is Stibbles' Codex of Companions with over 110 pages just filled to the brim with cool creatures that you can possibly tame and make your companion. Cool oozes, dragons, fae, and fiends. Each creature comes with lore, stats, a rarity number, how difficult it is to tame, and the environments where it can appear. The book has a robust set of rules on how and where these monsters appear and how would one go about taming them. And there is a level up system where you increase your bond with the pet. The higher it is, the more abilities it can get and the more it can help you while you play. Further, there are a bunch of feats that you can give to your pet when you level it up and extra abilities that one can choose if you wish to make your pet combat worthy. The book is filled with support for this playstyle too, with tons of new spells designed with pets in mind. There are magical items to help you, for example, mount and fight alongside some of the pets, and even a cool duel system where you can pit your pet against other players' pets, Pokemon style. Check out Stibbles' Codex of Companions in the link below. You will not regret it. Now, back to the show. Now this here is a monster manual entry for both the fire snake and the salamander. Why? Because they are, of course, one and the same. Right off the bat, we're told that salamanders hatch from eggs that are 2-foot diameter spheres of smoldering obsidian, but when they hatch, they actually hatch as fire snakes, and it is not only a year later when the fire snake then matures into a real salamander. After that, though, we have 3 major topics that they cover for this creature, the first being their history of being slaves. It says here that long ago, the Ifrit hired Assers to build the fabled city of brass, but then failed in their attempt to enslave the mystical race when the Assers' work was done. We, of course, have seen this lore a few times now in the past couple of videos. Then it says, turning instead to strike against the salamanders, the Ifrit had better luck in establishing a slave race, which they used to unleash war and destruction across the plains. And down here, it further says that the Ifrit suffer salamanders to serve no other master. When Ifrit encounter salamanders dedicated to the cult of elemental evil, they slay them rather than taking them as slaves. See, that is an interesting piece of new lore, because in the past, that was actually not the case. The salamanders have, for the most part, always been a mostly free society, and that is because of the power of their leaders, which the monster manual does cover here next. It says, although salamanders follow the destructive impulses of their fiery nature, slavery under the Ifrit has impacted the culture of free salamanders. They rule their own societies according to the Ifrit model, in which larger and stronger salamanders claim dominion over the lesser kin. As salamanders age, they increase in size and status, rising to positions of power as cruel nobles amongst their kind. Nobles rule wandering bands of salamanders which move across the elemental plane of fire like desert nomads, raiding other communities for treasure. Now, of course, we will talk a bit about why there is actually a lot more about salamander societies than just this, but I do want to point out that a lot of this is actually new. Now, lastly, it does talk about the Salamander's great ability at metal forging, which of course they are very well known for. I mean, really, almost every single major civilization on the plane of fire is godlike at metal crafting, so this honestly comes as no surprise. Their inherent advantage, however, versus others is that they can bend metal with their own hands, since salamanders themselves are crazy hot, so they don't have to rely on cumbersome tools like perhaps the Ifrit or the Acers. In any case, here we have the stat sheets. Notably, of course, salamanders are vulnerable to cold. Glad that they kept that in. They resist non-magical weapon strikes, which is something that salamanders have had since literally the first edition, so again, really glad that they kept these things in the game. A salamander's body and weapons exude dangerous heat, which is deadly to any who touches them, so they rely heavily on grapples and tail attacks to deal extra fire damage. And then lastly, they carry their trusted spear, which it doesn't seem like the monster manual really mentions, but spears are actually a thing in Salamander society. Everyone in there uses spears. It's funny because they never mention in the lore why that is the case, what is their particular fascination with spears, but their particular love for spears is legendary, and almost every single edition has at least made a point to point out their spears in one way or another. In any case, that's it for the entry in the monster manual. Let's go ahead and talk about what they don't tell you about salamanders. Now, the first thing to understand about salamanders is that there are actually more than one kind of salamander, and this part here is crucial. When the monster manual tells you that salamanders are enslaved by the Ifriti, it can be a little misleading because the salamanders that you are actually thinking of are not the ones that the monster manual is mostly referencing here. I mean, all kinds of salamanders, of course, will eventually fall into slavery here and there, but for the most part, the actual type of salamander that the Ifriti can rein in and unilaterally control are what we call the Flame Brothers, or their more crude term, lesser salamanders. A lesser salamander is literally that, a weaker and less wise version of a standard salamander, and in fact, the majority of salamanders are actually this. Many explorers actually confuse the lesser salamanders as juvenile versions of normal salamanders, when in reality, they are their own species. The lore described their relationships and mannerisms similar to that of goblins and hobgoblins. We know that they are different things, yet they're kind of also the same, but one of them controls and guides the other. Well, lesser salamanders, or fire brothers, are bestial and aggressive. They tend to savagery and tribalism when they are left to their own devices, and so standard, normal salamanders rein them in and civilize them for their own good. It is then through this control that their tribes maintain stability. Now, these lesser salamanders, because they are so easy to control and guide, are the perfect fodder in military skirmishes, not just for the standard salamanders, but also for other races, and this is where the Ifriti start back coming into play. Like many other races, Ifriti can easily control these lesser creatures and then breed them and then send them to war. Now, salamanders have no sex, they actually reproduce asexually. Most of them outwardly look like males, but that is merely the aspect that they are born with. About 80% of salamanders would have a male aspect, while 20% would have a female aspect. The males have flaming beards and mustaches, while females have flowing fiery red hair. Both aspects have yellow eyes that sometimes switch to fluorescent green. Now, the way that they reproduce is actually automatic, with the salamander having no say in the matter and not being able to stop it once it starts. Basically, every 10 years, the salamander will automatically start budding and splitting off a larva during a very painful weekly process. Quote, "The first sign of bodying is a swelling at the tip of the salamander's tail. The lump grows and spreads upwards through the tail, increasing in size each day. Salamanders are extremely irritable and more vicious than normal during this time. From the 2nd to the 5th day, the lump slows the salamander's movement by 1/2 and prevents it from constricting. By the 6th day, the salamander's entire body is swollen and the creature is practically immobile. It cannot attack, it loses its dexterity bonus to AC, and its speed is reduced by another 5 feet. On the 7th day, the salamander's skin splits open, releasing the original adult salamander with a new skin, plus 1 larva, end quote. After bodying, a salamander will be physically overly sensitive and will avoid touching or grappling most things. Now, the larva will have to incubate for about a year in order to evolve into a mature salamander. The incubation requires the larva to be in constant presence of a heat source. Outside of a fire, the larva will simply just cannot survive. If somehow prevented from being in such close proximity to a heat source, it will cool rapidly and then die as its body hardens into a substance resembling something like charred wood. Not that this is really possible in the plane of fire, but anywhere else this can be a huge fear for salamander communities. After a year of incubation, the larva will swell rapidly, tripling in size over the course of 1 week. While swelling, it wouldn't be able to move, and then at the end of that week, the larva's skin would split, releasing then an adult salamander. Now again, this larva is in fact what adventuring companies would now call fire snakes. They are of course one and the same. And also again, this larva shown here on the monster manual is probably more likely a larva for a lesser salamander. Lesser salamanders and their larva look different to standard salamanders and their larva. See, lesser salamanders' larvae are described as a fat snake or worm with a pink hide, whereas a standard salamander's larvae are described as fat-looking maggots. In any case, going back to the lesser salamanders being used as slaves, you can now see how or why they are incredible for war. You can have 1,000 of these lesser salamanders, which by the way don't need to eat anything, and then every 10 years they butt off a larva, which all you have to do is keep it in a fire, and then a year later you have another 1,000 mature lesser salamanders, which of course in turn, in another 10 years, will basically double themselves off again. It's actually just silly because you have to do nothing. Now, those are the lesser and standard salamanders, and then of course their respective fire snake larvae, but there is actually one more type of salamander to this group, and it is in fact the best one. The monster manual alluded to this, but didn't actually show it. They mentioned that the salamander nobles as being physically bigger, but oh man, they are much more than simply bigger. The salamander noble, just like other types of salamanders, is basically its own race as well. I do say basically, and that is because they are very different from the rest, but technically they don't reproduce, they come from the standards. See, the science of evolution between the salamanders is not perfect, or at least not perfectly understood by adventurers. There's definitely different larvae that spawns into lesser salamanders, and then there's different larvae that spawns into standard salamanders, but lesser salamanders can also simply evolve into normal salamanders over time. This is strange, it is rare, but apparently it does happen. Well, such is the case that then a standard salamander can then evolve into something greater, something far more powerful. The math checks out at about 1 in 100,000 that a salamander will have the potential for further evolution, but that very special salamander, after having the potential, will then have to survive for a long period of time in order to get to the point where it can evolve. The lore is a bit silly here. Less reliable sources of lore would claim that it would take about 50 years, but the second edition Monstrous Compendium, the Monster Manual of second edition, says 1,000 years. So it's difficult to tell exactly how long it would actually take, but the idea here is that after a long period of time, a special standard salamander can then evolve into a salamander noble. Now these guys, first of all, are huge, being sometimes about 32 feet in length, which is crazy, and many of them can be literal giants. Now most of the art that I'll be showing for these creatures is World of Warcraft art for the Flamewakers, but it really does set the theme and look for how these creatures would feel. I mean, look at this. This is how an old salamander novel would probably look like. It's awesome. Also, the way that you would go about being able to tell a salamander noble from another type of salamander in terms of the physical looks and not just the size would be by the antler-like horns that come out of the head of the creature. In general, if it has big horns, then it is a noble. Now, these creatures never truly stop growing over millennia, and they never grow old. They can live on forever. And of course, they also become more powerful over time. And they are described as being among the most powerful creatures on the elemental plane of fire. They are, as one would imagine, incredible fire sorcerers and wizards, but more so than that, they possess an ability that makes them infamous amongst adventurers and planar travelers. Salamanders have a special variation of dispel magic that allows them to dispel fire immunities from their enemies, as long as those enemies are not native to the plane of fire. They can dispel fire immunities given by magic items, or even those given by natural racial sources. Like, for example, they could actually remove the fire immunity from a devil, from a fire giant, or even from a red dragon. This, of course, would mean instant death for that creature in the plane of fire. This power alone literally makes the Salamanders an impossible enemy to attack by any metric for any race, other than perhaps the Ifriti, who would not be affected by this dispel magic and also would have, of course, the armies to challenge them. This is why I want to mention that in the lore, it does state that outside of deities and elemental princesses, the Salamander nobles are perhaps the only race that the Ifriti actually respect in terms of strength in the plane of fire, and it makes sense why. Now, we have spent this entire time just talking about the different variations of Salamanders, all of which were left out of the monster manual, but there's quite a few more things that are interesting that I want to talk about. For example, the monster manual didn't tell you where exactly did the fiery aura of the Salamander came from. See, the bodies of these creatures are super heated, but that's not necessarily enough to just create literal fire around them. I mean, at least the Acer have a reason why they are literally made of fire. They have elemental fire inside of their bodies. That's how they are given life. But where does the Salamander's fire come from? See, the Salamander doesn't need to eat. That is because it gains its sustenance from heat, but its body still goes through natural processes that require for it to dispose of bodily waste. In essence, even though Salamanders have a lot of magical qualities, they still need to poop. Salamanders dispose of waste using the spiky ridges and protrusions all over its body. Every single spike coming out of the tail or body of the Salamanders is effectively a butt. It simply ejects a liquid form of waste that has a very oily quality. Well, this waste in the form of oil basically combusts as soon as it leaves the body because of the heat of the elemental plane, combined with the heat of the body of the creature. When the oily waste combusts, it catches fire and turns into something of a fiery aura that lasts around the beast. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, Salamanders are always on fire. The reason the Salamanders deal so much damage when it is touched is mostly because of this fiery aura. Now, another thing that the monster manual didn't tell you is how Salamanders think. This is important because when you have a creature that doesn't need to eat, that doesn't require to seek a mate for reproduction, that doesn't require to find shelter to survive the environment. I mean, how is a creature like that motivated? Well, when you eliminate food, sex, and survival, all that's really left that can give one purpose is religion, though with the Ifriti using their power to prevent most of the slave Salamanders into joining the ranks of the gods or the elemental princesses, and with the Salamander nobles preventing the free ones from leaving, what the Salamanders are left with is, well, praying to fire itself. Quote, "Born of fire, nurtured by it, and surrounded by it constantly, Salamanders live by its rules and embrace its strength. Fire burns. Fire consumes, fire destroys. Fire represents the ultimate in strength and power, and Salamanders judge all things by their interactions with it. Earth and stone smoke and crack beneath a Salamander's fiery form, but withstand destruction, and so they earn its respect. Metal bends to the will of fire, but resists complete annihilation, and so the Salamanders employ it as a tool. Gems capture and reflect the light of fire, splitting it into dazzling displays of color and brilliance, and so the Salamanders prizes gems. All else is of little consequence. At the touch of fire, liquids boil away, papers turn to ash, and the creatures of the material plane cower. Thus, all of these earn only contempt from a Salamander." End quote. All major decisions that a Salamander will go through in life will be guided by these principles. Just how elvish civilizations will live and die praising the beauty of art, the beauty of trees and nature, a Salamander will spend his existence contemplating and admiring the power and beauty of fire. Quite natural indeed when it is such a crucial part of their existence. Fire gives them life, it nurtures their babies, and it destroys their enemies. Quote, "The worship of fire as both a creative and a destructive force is not a concept unique to salamanders, but as creatures born and refined to maturity in flames, they claim part of fire's divinity for themselves. As divine creatures in their own right, they feel it only natural that they have dominion over lesser beings. This attitude leads to the practice of slavery as a means of reinforcing the dominance of salamanders over inferior races." End quote. It is quite simple, really. If fire is divine, and salamanders are made of fire, then salamanders must be divine. It would then be only natural that those of fire are worthy of ruling over those that are not of fire. Or perhaps even more natural, to show them fire and let them burn so that they may achieve divinity, even if only momentarily. Also, all salamanders are immune to sleep, charm, and hold spells. No clue why the monster manual didn't put that in. And also, lastly, you can make potions of fire resistance with the blood of a salamander, and you can also use the metal of their spears for the more powerful ring of fire resistance. You can also use the antlers of the salamander nobles in order to create magical wands. Now, these wands would be able to cast a spell that the original noble would have been able to cast using its sorcerer's powers, or in the least, you would be able to cast wizard spells without using material components if you use such a wand as an arcane focus. Alright guys, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I would like to, of course, personally thank my Patreon supporters: 5E Magic Shop, Barry Maskant, Morgan Johnson, Rusty Rain, Biotechnofrag, Dog Feeder, Walker Motley, The Great Codini, Terry Culp, Omega Scales, Ozol, Alex Cookson, Benjamin Bosters, Falky951, Ordoric, Prince Light Morning Crown, Sabim Kurshab, Solarensis, Thomas Hunt, Chad Aga, Stephen, Bushido Burrito, Nathan McComb, Soulless Rider, Werewolven Games, Lost Crusader, Mr. Salty, Stalia, JD Green, Olaf Klepp, Treb909, Tony RC, Famine52, George Fotland, Sovereign Mind, Trevor Hess, Draglogia5, Hustur, Zeran King, Michael Walker, The Living Guild Pack, Streeblo, Herbert Johnson, and Describe for supporting me on Patreon at the $25 level. If you guys would like to support me as well, then please head on over to patreon.com/MrRex to support. Patreon.com/MrRex to support. Alright guys, once again, for a second time, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time on the Elemental Plane of Fire. By the way, before I go, do you guys have art for the Elemental Plane of Fire that you would like me to use, that you've made yourself? Then send it to the link in the description. Is the I believe it's rhexxart@gmail.com. Send it over there with the name that you want me to attribute it to. That would be, of course, greatly appreciated. And that's that. Thank you once again, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.